1800s and 1844. Had somewhat peripheral relationships with the United States throughout the time, with but notably in the 20th century was dictator puppet regime. Many Dominicans know Leonidas Trujillo, who was one of the most infamous dictators in the whole world. And fascist, outright supporter. He genocided many black Dominicans as well as Haitians. When he was overthrown in a popular revolt, Dominicans elected for the first time Juan Bosch, a left nationalist leader. The U.S. ousted Juan Bosch and put in place Trujillo's protege and American puppet Balaguer. And Balaguer, and since then has continued neo-colonial relationships with the United States. It was then that Dominicans began entering the United States, notably Washington Heights. And again, as the Dominican population in Washington Heights grew and expanded, they spilled over into the Bronx. So we see some of the patterns. Interesting fact is, around the same time that Dominicans were entering the United States, they weren't, from political reasons, they weren't given refugee status the same way Cubans were, which for different reasons, right? It was Dominican back. Dominicans had a pro-U.S. Regime, letting Dominican immigrants come in, but they weren't defined as refugees, whereas Cubans came in a more privileged strata, entering the United States because of the anti-communist sentiments towards Castro. But they weren't defined as the same way. Mexicans, having the longest history with the United States. Of course, the U.S. annexed half of Mexico from California to Texas in the 1840s. Mexicans have had a long-standing relationship with the U.S. Since NAFTA, Mexican immigration has exploded. Many Mexican immigrants have come in East Harlem as well, where Puerto Ricans have resided historically. And because of the expanding population, Mexicans also have spilled over into the Bronx as well, although in smaller numbers up until this time. There's also Jamaicans and other West Indians. In fact, the Bronx, a majority of black people in the Bronx tend to be West Indian, not necessarily African Americans nowadays, and also a growing African population, mainly from West Africa. But Jamaicans historically have one of the largest populations in the Bronx as well. Very different because Jamaicans they relate directly to British imperialism historically. More recently, because of debt accumulated from IMF loans, Jamaicans have immigrated to the U.S. since 1920s in smaller numbers, but in the past 30 years in larger numbers. But when we talk about processionality, we're talking about specific groups in relationship to different states, not racializations. Other groups do get racialized, of course. Let's move on. Now, because we're going to focus more on Latinos in the Bronx, being, I'm Latino from the Bronx, as well as Latinos make 60%, nearly 60% of the Bronx, well, 15% of the Bronx. Puerto Rico is the second largest Latino group after Mexicans in the United States, comprising 99% of the Hispanic population. In 2010, there's about 4.6 million people of Puerto Rican descent. That's more than Puerto Ricans on the island. Puerto Ricans on the island make about 3.8 million. And there's more Puerto Ricans in the United States than there is in Puerto Rico. Hispanics in the Bronx make up 50% of the population. That's more than 740,000 residents. This is out of 1.4 million people in the Bronx. So it's a very large population. We see in the breakdown of it is 300,000 Puerto Ricans, 241,000 Dominicans, 71,000 Mexicans, also with a growing Ecuadorian population. Now, we're going to look at the breakdown. We're going to looking at the maps. We see the different geographic distributions of people by and ethnic groups and race. The South Bronx being predominantly black and Latino, in the center and south. There's a large black population, which is many Jamaicans and West Africans up in the north. And there's also the white populations in the peripheries in the east, in the east and the west part of the Bronx towards the north. But the bulk of the people in the Bronx, and which is the South Bronx, and the South Bronx is Latino and black people following. And we're gonna look at. So, what is New York City? New York City is a world city. It's the financial capital of the world, right? New York City is the largest city in the United States by far. LA is only half the population. Inner LA, like LA proper, is only half the population of New York City. New York City is a world city. People from all over the world come here. It's a center of commerce. Now, what is the Bronx? The Bronx is the poorest district in the United States, right? New York City, in a world city, we have also the poorest district in the U.S. Why is this? Because the U.S. is more, the Bronx is like a resource for labor for New York City. And we see this right historically. We see the concentrations of minority groups on the map across New York City. We also see major manufacturing zones concentrated as well. It's interesting to note, right, that unlike most boroughs, the majority of people in the Bronx don't work there. The majority of people in the Bronx work in Manhattan. I mean, this just shows it shows what the relationship of political economy is. Capital does not reside in the Bronx. It does not circulate within the Bronx because people in the Bronx, they don't develop capital within where they live. They go into the Bronx, they work there, and develop and work for other people in Manhattan. What we see is, so we also see jobs have changed historically. New York has been a very industrial city up until the 1970s during deindustrialization. A lot of manufacturing not only moved out the United States, but it's moved out from the inner cities. Manufacturing moved a lot across to New Jersey as well as upstate, which is also parallel in some ways to white flight as manufacturing moved up, right, into Yonkers and Westchester and New Jersey. We saw also populations of like Irish